Immanuel Kant is considered to be one of the greatest philosophers of the Western world. We're going to consider Immanuel Kant's ethics in this podcast. First of all, note that Immanuel Kant was born in the year 1724 and died in the year 1804. This is helpful because, in many ways, his ideas are conditioned by the time frame in which he lived. It is, after all, during this particular time that the French Enlightenment occurred. The Enlightenment, as many people know, is oftentimes referred to as the Age of Reason. It was an age in which people wished to throw off the shackles of religion and what they deemed to be superstition in favor of pure reason. The notion was that reason, if guided properly, would lead us, that is humanity, to truth. Immanuel Kant's ethics is referred to as a deontology or a deontological framework. The word deontology stems from the ancient Greek root deon, which when literally translated means duty. And so right from the outset, you can see that Immanuel Kant's ethics are going to very much focus on the role of duty in ethical decision-making. He is further going to say that morality and ethics is grounded in reason. It's not grounded in tradition, intuition, notions of conscience, emotion, or even attitudes such as sympathy. Once again, think about the historical time frame in which he lived, this age of reason where people wished to throw off tradition, to essentially get rid of tradition in terms of allowing it to have any kind of influence on their decision-making processes. He also says that the moral worth of an action depends exclusively on the rule of obligation. Now, that's kind of hard for us to understand sometimes because we like to think that the moral worth of an action might depend on our predisposition. For example, if we are good-hearted and we want to do good for others. That is not the case for Immanuel Kant. According to him, the moral worth, so what makes an action actually have a moral value, is that it is done exclusively because we know we ought to do it. We are obliged to do it. It is our duty. And he even further says that we act not just in accordance with, but for the very sake of obligation. Once again, compare this to other ethical frameworks, for example, that talk about maximizing happiness, such as utilitarianism. You'll see that Immanuel Kant is very, very different than that he contrasts sharply, because for him, our actions are not about producing more happiness for more people or anything of the sort, or acting according to our nature, like natural law holds out. Rather, it is acting exclusively because in our reason, we deduce that we must do something or we must not do something else. He says that duty is a meaningful concept only to the extent that it must bind every rational subject. By every rational subject, we are referring, after all, to human persons. He says that if duty is a meaningful concept, then it is something that every single human person must share in. And that is to say that it must be categorical. He makes a distinction between categorical imperatives, which we're going to spend a lot more time on, and hypothetical imperatives. Let me start from hypothetical imperatives, just by way of defining what that means. A hypothetical imperative is something that we believe we ought to do, and it's largely based on our own tastes. So, for example, if I say that I should wear a jacket because I'm getting cold, that is a hypothetical imperative. That applies only to me. It only has to do with whether or not I feel a certain way, cold or warm. If I say that I ought to eat broccoli, well, again, in terms of self-interest, that might be something that I want to do, but it's not something that binds every rational subject. On the other hand, when we say that something is categorical, we mean that it is always, everywhere the case. In other words, we're looking for imperatives, we're looking for rules of of morality, rules of obligation that must be done by everyone in all instances and all cases. And he says this must be done from respect. Respect, again, not as a feeling, because he very much wants to move away from the domain of feelings as having any role in ethical decision-making, but rather respect is an essential predisposition before my reason. That is, that my reason recognizes that there is something I must do or something that I must not do. So another way to look at this is to ask the question, well, what exactly is moral for Kant? What is, in other words, what is it that actually has ethical value? Well, he says that something has moral value if it is, again, done from this sense of duty, respect for a moral law. And right from his text, actually, the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals, he says, the moral value of our actions must lie in the principle that guides the will, and this is what you might want to underline, without regard to the ends that can be attained by the actions. In other words, I am not looking at the telos. This is in complete opposition to teleology. I'm not looking at the ends or the purpose or the goal of an action. Instead, I am allowing my will to be guided by a principle, and I don't even know what the consequences may be, but I must respect that I know in my reason that I must do such and such or not do whatever else. Something lacks moral value for him if it is from what he refers to as self-interest or also direct inclination. So in other words, if I'm doing something so that I can feel good about it, for him that has no moral value. If I'm doing something because others have told me that I should do something, but I haven't reasoned to it on my own, he says that has no moral value. Even such actions as not lying or cheating or stealing, those actions even do not have moral value if the only reason why I am not lying, cheating, or stealing is because I've been told not to do so. In my reason, I must arrive at the true principle of that which I ought to do and that which I ought not to do. He states that the good will acts from duty, and it respects the moral law. Notice, this is a reasoned submission to a maxim, to what he refers to as the objective rational principle that all of us would pick up on no matter where we are, no matter what time, place, culture, language, etc. It is a reasoned, that's a very important word, it is a reasoned submission to a maxim. Well, what is a maxim? A maxim is a principle on which a particular subject in fact acts. So a maxim is essentially our rule of acting. And if you think about it, we have many, many different maxims. If we were to write several down, I bet you could come up with a page in a rather short amount of time. For example, I will not cheat. I will not lie. I will not steal. I will not hurt another person simply to get ahead. Whatever that action is, that principle of acting, that is in fact a maxim. And what he says is that we must be able to universalize a maxim. That is, we must be able to make it categorical. So here's the question then. What is the maxim that every rational being would actually, in fact, assent to? Well, every rational being would follow what he refers to as the categorical imperative, if they're truly being rational. The categorical imperative, think about it, categorical, always, everywhere the case. It is unconditional. Imperative, something that I must do. So notice, here is his articulation of it. I am never to act unless I am acting on a maxim, that principle of acting, that I can will, in other words, I want, and I can conceive, I can in my mind understand rationally. So I am never to act unless I'm acting on a maxim that I can will and conceive to become a universal law. Another way of saying this is to say that I must be, without contradiction, able to universalize this maxim as a norm of conduct. This must be done irrespective of personal desires or even the desires of others. So, for example, if you think about it, it makes a great deal of sense. My maxim is that I will never break a promise. How do I know that it would be not morally permissible for me to break a promise? Well, if I were to break a promise, according to Kant, I am also willing and with very poor reasoning, conceiving a world in which everybody breaks a promise. Now, if everybody broke a promise, what would there no longer be that makes a promise a promise? The expectation that people have, the trust that people have in others. If you really break it down, you recognize that the very notion of a promise requires these other principles, requires these other factors. If I broke a promise and thereby said, I will that everyone breaks a promise, would there any longer be such a thing as trust? The answer is clearly no. And if nobody is trusting anyone ever again, is there really such a thing as breaking a promise? In other words, I have actually self-refuted my maxim. I have actually acted so illogically as to completely obliterate the very principle upon which I act. This can be clearly seen with other examples as well. If I ask myself, should I steal? What is my duty here? Should I steal or should I not steal? Well, would I want everyone in the entire world to steal? If everyone stole, what would there no longer be? Well, there would no longer be personal property, no? If there's no longer such a thing as personal property, is there any longer such a thing as stealing? If you think about it, this is something that probably our parents taught us from a very young age, although I doubt very much that they said that Immanuel Kant came up with it. But if you think about it, when you were probably young and you went to a grocery store and you took something that wasn't yours and you just didn't know better, your parents might have stopped you and scolded you and said, don't do that. Don't take something that is not yours, that you didn't pay for. And you may have, if you were anything like me, you probably asked why. And they might have said, well, how would you like if everyone did this? Or steal, or lying even. If you think about that, you lied and your parents said don't do that, and you didn't really understand why you shouldn't do that. And so you asked your parents why, and they might very well have said, well, how would you like if everybody did that? Well, that's exactly what Kant is saying. Now, there's another way of putting this. There's actually a second version of the categorical imperative. Now, I want to emphasize this is a second version. This is not another categorical imperative. There is only one categorical imperative according to Kant, but he believes that there are other ways of saying the same thing. For example, he says that one must act to treat every person as an end in themselves and never merely as a means. Why does he say that? Because if you think about it, first of all, would you want to live in a world where people always treated each other as means? What does it mean to be treated as a means? Well, it means to be exploited, right? It means to be used. Would you want to live in that world? Would you want that to be universalized as a maxim that everybody abided by? So he says, right from the outset, we recognize that we would not want to universalize that the very same principle that is at stake in the categorical imperative that says, I am not going to do anything unless I will and conceive that everybody do the same thing, leads me immediately to say, we must act never to treat other persons as means, but always as an end in themselves. And as a matter of fact, Immanuel Kant believes that human persons are the only beings that actually exist as an end in themselves. In other words, they don't exist for the sake of something else. They exist for themselves. They are what he refers to as an objective end. And so we can never use another person. Now, granted, we probably do use people, if you think about it, and that's why that second version says never merely as a means. So if you go to McDonald's and you order a burger, the person who is serving it to you is actually a means to your end getting the burger. But is there a way to treat that person that they're not merely a means? And this is a great point for further discussion in class. He says that there is yet a third way of stating the categorical imperative, and that is to say that the will of every rational being is a will that makes its own universal law. He says the will, so, our center from which we act, it is subject to the law because the will is its own author. In other words, the law does not come from outside of ourselves. It comes right out of our own reason. It is tied into our own will, what we want, what we intend. This is another way of saying that autonomy is very, very important. That autonomy is actually its own value. It's by virtue of our autonomy that we are given respect, value, and proper motivation. Well, what is autonomy? It is essentially freedom. It is essentially the ability to act out of our own will without coercion. This does not rule out using people, by the way, for testing or things of that nature, because ultimately what he's driving towards is the very important role of consent. That consent actually validates the ethical nature of our decisions. When we say yes or no to something truly freely, not being coerced, not being manipulated, not out of fear, not out of any other factor than simply our rational, reasoned, that is, submission to a maxim, that we know that we are making the right choice.